Hello, and welcome to the Magistic Chat episode 16, I believe. We're getting to the point where I lose count. And my name is Chris Allaun. I go by the pronouns of he and him. I am a published author with both Mandrake of Oxford as well as books. And I would like to introduce Ruby Ruse next. Ruby,
Hello,
introduce yourself.
I'm Ruby Ruse. You may see Amy Alice as my profile name, but the reason that I use Ruby Ruse is that I have a YouTube channel called Fairy Fortunes, and that is the name I use on my Fairy Fortunes YouTube channel. On Fairy Fortunes, I talk about fairy folklore, fairy magic, and fairy events happening, although not in 2020. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm here to learn and how to be a better ally. And if I didn't already say so, I use she, her pronouns. And I'm very excited to introduce Laura Gonzalez.
Greetings and salutations, Earthlings. My name is Laura Gonzalez, she, her, and I am a priestess of the goddess. I am a podcaster. I am a tarot reader. I am a witch for hire. And you can find me on Circle Sanctuary Network podcast as well as Saber Sanar. I do podcasts in English and Spanish. I've been doing for like 10 years. So there's tons of work out there and interviews of common and et cetera, et cetera. So you can find me on CSM podcast. And obviously I do this wonderful Mystic Chat video blog. And with that, Luke, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Luke. I am a eclectic hard polytheist, jack of all trades as far as magic goes. You can see my work over at the Wild Hunt mostly. I'm also in the upcoming Loki devotional coming from the Troth. Keep an eye out for that. And I mean, you'll hear more about me later, I'm sure. I will let our guest star introduce themselves.
Thanks, Luke. I don't know if you said your pronouns.
They, them.
Okay, thank you. I'm Theo Angus, and I write under Gede Parma, which is my birth name. I'm a Balinese Australian witch. I go by they, them, there. I have published books and I teach a lot, and I'm a professional witch, also witch for hire, like Laura, and what else can I say? I work mostly within 3 particular traditions of the craft, namely Wildwood, Anderson Fairy, and Reclaiming, but I have also learnt in others, and I weave it all in my own personal praxis. Yeah, and I'm really into kind of ecstatic mysticism and witchcraft as sacred resistance, and my byline kind of for that is that I think of witches as enemies of empire. So that's kind of how I do my thing. That's check.
Okay, so what we're talking about today is that our spiritual leaders in the magical and pagan community who are basically anti-trans or just not being inclusive. So I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about the experiences and what we can do to basically eradicate that whole notion. Fia, what is your thoughts about that?
Okay.
Just tell us your thoughts, everyone.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, so I want to say first that when I was first approached to come onto this call, I asked, I didn't know obviously the whole setup, so I asked these 2 questions. I said, are there trans people and women on this group? Because I'm an AMAD, for those people who don't know what that term means. It's assigned male at birth. So there's also assigned female at birth. So you'll hear AMAB or AFAB. And there are, of course, intersex people, but the binary medical system does that, right? But I've always had a consistent experience for myself of being non-binary. I used to say genderless when I was a teenager, but then the non-binary language came in and I adopted it, right? But okay, so in witchcraft in the West, so the United States, Canada, like New Zealand, Australia, Britain, whatever, we have this huge influence and impact from obviously Gardnerian witchcraft, which is initiatory, but there are a lot of spin-offs of that, and a lot of the early published works were written by initiates of either the Alexander's lineage or the Gardner lineage and all the lineages that they promulgated. And there is this teaching, as far as I can see in published works, like the Witch's Bible Complete by Janet and Stuart Farrar, so I'm just going on what is published, of this idea of gender polarity, that there are roles for priests and roles for priestesses. And I've confirmed this with dear friends of mine who are Gardnerian. They're like, yes, that is true. Because sometimes they say we can neither confirm nor deny. And I'm like, just tell me whether or not you do this particular thing. Anyway, so that's true, right? So that sets up this binary gender experience within that system, or rather there's roles for priests and roles for priestesses. But how that kind of has gone out into the wider, I guess we would now call it the neo-pagan community, especially the one that's kind of happened through the 70s and 80s in the United States, where people started rubbing shoulders and swapping lore and getting together, was that, this idea that, number one, apparently pagans and witches are just like, not completely saturated by the same bullshit that everyone else is saturated by. That is not true. So the mostly white, the mostly cis, the mostly heterosexist kind of witchcraft pagan crowd of the 60s, 70s, and 80s brought this attitude, right? They probably didn't even know what a trans person was, but they existed. But they brought this attitude of like, white supremacy. And people hear that term and they're like, oh, there's people like burning crosses on lawns. Actually, white supremacy is just insidious. It's everywhere. I've dealt with it all my life, and inside this one as well, because we all swallow that pill. We're all taught to be that way, and to hold whiteness above all else, to hold maleness above all else, to hold heterosexuality above all else, and to hold cisness above all else. So cisness being like CIS, being this idea that when you are born and assigned female or male at birth by your parents, by society, by the medical system, that you're agreeing with that assignment, right? That you're okay with it, comfortable with it, and agreeing with it. And that any experience that diverges from that, where you might not agree, where you might experience dysphoria or gender euphoria at your evolving gender, or have some other kind of experience, of which there are many, that anything that deters or diverges from the gender binary of man and woman as being related to these very reductive, simplistic notions of genitalia or whatever, or social roles, is wrong, and therefore does not fit into magical systems. Just like that, like I've been rereading Bull of Heaven by Michael Lloyd, which is about Eddie Basinski and his whole kick in New York in the 70s and 80s. And Eddie Basinski was a homosexual cis man, but he disrupted entire lineages. And that there's like a fucking hefty tome that you could throw at someone and knock them out with, based on that. So like back then it was gay people, like, covens were like, no to gay people. And maybe they were also no to trans people. I have heard that there was a trans woman in one of the early Gardner covens, so, and people knew. And I know many trans people involved in Gardnerian and Alexandrian craft. So all things evolve, all things change. But I guess the issue now is in the wider umbrella community. And even now I'm like, for the past 5 years, I've been unsure if I even fit in that umbrella of paganism. Like, I really don't know. I'm a witch, and sometimes that intersects, but that's a whole other conversation. But, for instance, I was at PantheaCon one year, and I've only been once, and I made the decision that one time in 2016 to never go again. But, because it was a shocking display of like the worst of, I guess, American society, but so white supremacy, heterosexism, cis supremacy, like racism. And there is just this toxic thing at a lot of those festivals and conferences that goes unquestioned, because it's people assume that we are, as pagans and witches and occultists, special and exempt from this history and these like social realities, and therefore won't bring our magic or our political inquiry or our social inquiry into unpacking how we might be centering particular ways of being, you know? Like I want to evoke Bell Hooks's phraseology, which is, you know, the white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy. So, you know, Bell Hooks is often talking about that as the entity. She has named that as the egregoric entity or the underlying system that we are all kind of trying to dismantle or fight within ourselves and grow away from. And transness is in there too. Like, I'm so aware that I'm saying all of this as, you know, as someone who shares parallel experiences, but who doesn't identify as trans. I think there's a huge problem in pagan and occult and witchcraft leadership, however, with people remaining silent and people refusing to learn about trans experiences. So that's probably what we're here to talk about. But it's always occurred to me as really strange and arrogant and like willfully ignorant. And there are many leaders who are willing to learn and change and grow. Yeah, that's my first thing I'll say.
That's your first thing. You know, one of the things that when we were discussing the topic of the show, the reason I was so excited about this is because, you know, being a pagan leader myself, we should call each other out. Absolutely. And I'm actually very grateful that in the fellowship of the Phoenix, we call each other out all the time. I mean, not publicly, but let me tell you, if something happens, someone will say, hey, Chris, I didn't like what you said. And I'm very thankful for that. When I actually wrote an article a little while back about questioning spiritual leaders when it came to racism. And that article, it was so funny. There's a pagan leadership group. I was almost kicked out of that group because I disturbed the peace. And I was like, okay, but aren't we leaders? Aren't we leaders? And what was interesting is you had half the people who were like, yes, let's question leaders. And then you had other people who were like, no, let's not do that. And so I'm really on board this idea of why are we not challenging each other? Why are we accepting this behavior? You know.
Well, and there's a couple of questions I think that I'm hearing in sort of this, in just what you just said, Chris. One of them is, what's a pagan leader? What makes them a leader? Why are we giving leadership or the title of leadership to somebody? I suggest that they've been around for a while. Do they have some sort of like accreditation from their group? And then also I think there's this question of accountability, right? And you know, I think you were talking a little bit about this before we started, because I think, and this is just one of my soapboxes, I think that American paganism has this idea that everybody needs to be able to figure out what they do and find their own path. And if you have any critique of anybody else's path, then you are an aggressor. And so it doesn't really leave any room in a lot of spaces for, I like the idea of calling in for mutual accountability, for collaboration on things even, because since we are all supposed to be able to like find our own spiritual way, which again, what's a leader? Then there's not really any sort of normalized space in order to be in relationship.
So you brought up some very interesting points, Luke, and I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is it's one thing to question our leaders and question authority, because if we're not questioning authority, then we're following into a cult-like behavior where there is going to be abuse of power if we're not questioning the authority. But I do think that we have to be very careful about when we attack each other for spiritual beliefs that we hold. I remember having a beautiful conversation many years ago with Theo, actually, because Theo, I don't know if you still work with Persephone, but I was so excited to meet another person that worked with Persephone. And what was beautiful about talking with you and hearing your stories is they so much validated my own experience with her, and it was this beautiful moment. But there have been times where you have an experience with divinity and someone else has another experience with divinity. And then instead of saying, oh, that's very interesting that your experience is different than mine, is that one person says, you're wrong. Your experience is not valid. Mine is the only experience that matters. So I do think that we need to look at pagan leadership in the terms of accountability and authority, and realizing that that is important to question. But when we're talking about personal spiritual experience, that we do not have the right to tell someone that their experience is not valid.
Exactly.
And I think that, to just clarify what I was getting at, right? Like I'm not saying that people shouldn't have their own experiences, right? Like I'm a hard polytheist. If I didn't have UPG, I wouldn't have a practice. And like that's really important to me. And I agree, a lot of the really lovely moments that I've had in pagan space is sharing individual experiences when they differ, when they are the same, and being able to still be solid and knowledgeable in my own, right? I think that's a different kind of knowledge than what we're talking about when we're talking about trans rights, right? I think that personal experience, and I might call on some people to help me like tease out the difference that I'm going for here, because I think that personal relational experience, right? The relationship you have with Persephone versus the relationship Theo has with Persephone, right? You can't argue with each other. You can't be like, you don't actually have that relationship, right?
But a lot of people do that, though. A lot of people are quick to say, you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You say, like the latest argument on YouTube and TikTok within this pagan community was, you can't say love and light anymore. You can't say, I wish you love and light, that's now offensive to say to someone. And it's like, but I want you to have love in your, it's very strange. And because it's like your experience, the idea is that your experience is valid. And I think maybe that's what the problem is with the trans community, is that we're seeing certain groups of people saying to our trans pagan brothers and sisters and people that their experience doesn't have validation, that it's not valid, and that's completely untrue.
I think a lot of the problem comes from language, which was what we were talking right before we started the show. When we have a language that is so limiting, it limits our experiences in our mind. It's been researched and scientifically proven. Don't ask me to quote who or how, but I know
Sapir-Whorf, I think is who you're referring to, but go on.
That, when you have that limitation on language, you cannot understand the experience. Take, for instance, a person who's bilingual like me, and I understand English and I understand Spanish, and ergo I understand both cultures, and I can see the differences, right? So when we talk in paganism about the masculine divine and the feminine divine, we're encapsulating the masculine divine into only this set of qualities, the feminine divine into only this set of qualities. And if you were born with certain genitalia, you're supposed to experience just one or the other. And me being such Athena, Virgo mind, analytic witch, I have experienced a lot of the masculine divine, though my genitalia does not match. So because we call that masculine, it's like, oh, Laura, what do you mean you're experiencing masculine divine? You shouldn't, because you're a woman, because you're a cisgender woman. So if we were to take the masculine and feminine, and this is something I take from the Mexica Tenochca philosophy, things could be intense and subtle. Things can be direct and analytic, or they could be whispers, and and that doesn't mean that it's masculine or feminine. It could be anything. And we are so adamantly denying that transgender women do not experience the feminine divine because their genitalia was different from that of a cisgender women when they were born. And I don't see, first of all, who are we to say that they don't experience the feminine divine? And since when we base our divine experiences on our genitalia? So it has to do a lot with language. And if we were to undo this masculine, feminine, divine, and we started calling it something different, maybe we will have some room for inclusion. And this is what we're trying to do. I know the Fraternity of the Goddess is trying to do, and I know Circle Sanctuary, we're trying to do, and other folks that I know, Eric Eldridge and other folks in the DC area, they're trying to create new language so we can conserve the essence of neo-paganism and Wicca, but without being exclusive, because God has no gender. God is they, them. I mean, there is no, who knows? Nobody knows the gender of the divine, if the divine has a gender.
And I think, and Theo, you haven't said anything for a while, so I'm going to toss it to you after this. But I think part of that, right? Like, there's this idea of like culture being the thing that decides what gender roles are, right? So like American culture has very defined, like, this is what a man is supposed to do and this is what a woman is supposed to do. That is not universal, right? It has not been universal over time. It hasn't even been universal in the continent of North America, right? It is very contingent to late 2000s or early 2000s, late 1900s American culture, right? So that's part of it. Second of most, we've been using the word genitalia a lot, and I am just deeply reminded of like one of the first times my God phone actually like thoroughly turned on, right? Because I was sitting there being like, what are the relationships between the gods? Like, these two, are they fucking? Are they related? Are they like, what are you guys up to? And the God phone was like, do you think the gods have dicks? Like, is this, like, sometimes we borrow them occasionally.
Yeah.
But like, so much of how we identify like sex and gender is so human and so rooted in the physical, that like a lot of the time we're just projecting like hell. So it's my 2 cents.
I think, so many thoughts. Well, first I want to say that yes, Persephone is still central to my life. Absolutely, that feels irrevocable. But then so many things. Like, I guess one thing that I want to note is happening right now in my body, and I have this experience that body is everything. So I'll just go with what I'm experiencing in the body, which is, wilder and wiser and deeper than we know. That I feel like a lot of sorrow, not necessarily around what anyone has said, but just that we're having this conversation at all. Like, I'm like, really? Because when I was young, maybe I was very privileged in this way, and I think I really was by the way I was raised, but I had all around me drag queens, trans women, queer people, and my mother especially, and my father, who is a Balinese man. My mother is an Australian woman, a white Australian woman. Like, I would ask just curious kid questions like, oh, who is that? What's that about? And they would answer really simply. like, oh, that's a woman who was, you know, born in this way, but they're a woman. And I'm like, okay, cool. And the kid is just like, ding, whatever, like moving along, like, you know, and unless the parents are really like, no, there's a binary, and then the kid will fucking swallow that and continue along. But I was so lucky. I never had a sense ever. I can't remember ever having a sense that my parents were projecting gender onto me. Like, ever. They let me wear whatever I want. Like, is a dress feminine? Like, according to certain social mores, yes, but in Balinese culture, people who are men walk around in sarongs all the time, which is like a skirt, but like, and, you know, all through Polynesia. So, you know, and when people get married, and most often in Bali and cultures like Bali, it's a man and a woman getting married, but like both people will completely cover their face in makeup, like drag style makeup. You should look up those photos. It's brilliant, with like red lips, both of them. So certain things that in Australian white society would be deemed as, you know, like, oh no, so feminine, would be taken on. Something that I also feel is important to mention is that still to this day, that which is relegated to the feminine is considered lesser, you know, still to this day. Right. So like, right. That's why there is violence against trans women. You know, that's why still to this day, an effeminate young gay boy walking down the street will be yelled at, you know, in this suburb, you know, from a moving car, you know, because they are daring to or inhabiting what the culture has said is feminine. And so, you know, or a cis woman who's walking down the street kind of just like being themselves and owning their power and having long hair and wearing makeup and being femme or whatever with high heels, that is also attacked. So I just, you know, so that's another thing, that the feminine is still to this day, why aren't we better already? You know, relegated to the dumpster bin fire. And I just think that, why can't we have educated conversation and emotionally intelligent and open-hearted conversation around how this is true, and around how trans misogyny is a real thing? Like, by which I mean, like, I have to define that, because some people will hear something else.
Like what?
Oh yeah, very
Sorry,
yeah.
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, well, trans misogyny is just a way of talking about like the specific social realities, especially of especially women of color, trans women of color, and how there's like the misogyny of white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy can be like directly targeting trans women of color. Specifically in a specific set of ways that are different to the experience of cis women. And so I guess I always get a bit funny because I'm a non-woman and I don't want to take up space talking about women. But one thing I observe is that, like, there seems to be this thing, and it's such a white feminism thing, where it's like, women, we all have the same experience, women. And it's like, really? because a white woman living in Connecticut, who, you know, who is raised by a whole bunch of Connecticut folk, is going to have a very different experience than a black woman in the Bronx who has 7 kids and is probably in a lower socioeconomic group in that particular area. So these two experiences of womanhood are completely distinct and treated differently by the overculture. And then you have a trans woman of color maybe in Manhattan as well, or Chicago or Dallas, and they're going to have a very different experience too. So I just think this idea of reducing the experience of being a woman is so often what we would now call white feminism, which is just an easy way in academia to point at a very particular phenomenon and go, this is what this is. This is when whiteness intersects with feminism. And I feel like some people get really reactive when, to me, I'm just like interested. I'm like, let's break this down. Let's talk about this. Like, I don't want to defend whiteness. I don't want to defend maleness. I don't want to defend, you know, because this is all constructed. I'm interested in breaking it down. And I don't think we're ever going to find an essential anything, because everything is always in process, right? A lot of pagans, we want to look back because we feel like we lost something. Because we did, because there was a point in history when a bunch of European, specifically, you know, modern paganism often draws from Europe and the Middle East and Northern Africa, but like specifically when we look back, We see how the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Reformation fucked over a bunch of ethnic groups of people who once upon a time, and still do in some cases, had their ancestral customs, their connection to land in the same way that people in Turtle Island in Australia do, like these indigenous connections, thousands of years old with land, with the river, with the mountain, with their ancestral gods. And that many people who are now called white in the system, like that was chopped off. So of course there's this ancestral dispossession, or there's this dispossession trauma, which actually continues to ripple through and really fuck us all over. And that's what whiteness wants it. Like, whiteness is this monster. And I'm not talking about people with pale skin. I'm talking about the entity or the idea of whiteness, right? Whiteness, TM. That's what I want you to see when I say it. That idea of whiteness, which is really pretty much invented in the United States, like it wants to assimilate. It wants to take away your ancestry. It wants to take away your religious distinctions. It wants to take away your specific, beautiful, sophisticated understanding that there are 6 genders. It wants to take away your connection to the land. It wants to take away your connection to your children and how you raise children in a community. And it wants you to be American or Australian or British and serve the empire. Like, this is literally what's going on to this day. And I think it's bullshit. And it annoys me, especially when witches, specifically witches, buy into that shit. Because I'm like, isn't our magic, aren't our traditions about unbinding that? And then, you know, if we need to, cursing and binding, whatever, but like unbinding that crap so that we can come into a place of being in right relationship with ourselves, our ancestors, our descendants, each other, the gods, and the land. And I just think it's much more interesting and healthy for us to respect diversity, which nature, and I am a part of nature, you're a part of nature, clearly shows is true. Like, diversity is nature's strength. When there is biodiversity, it is things are stronger. When there is a more sophisticated web, things are more likely to flourish and co-evolve and thrive. We know this from observing. You know, so I feel like, you know, older forms and older paradigms of psychology and science are used as weapons to hinder and hurt marginalized groups of people who are already being hindered and hurt out there. And so the real issue is, why the fuck is it going on in communities that supposedly are inclusive and also sitting on this like strange narrative of the burning times, like, which is, you know, or like sitting on ideas that should be unpacked. Like, so, you know, this false idea of persecution. Like, yes, pagans and witches are persecuted in different ways, and obviously pagans were persecuted, but in this modern era, it's very different. You know, it's very different, and I feel like there is so much that we still, as a movement or a series of interlocking movements, because that's really, I think, what's going on. There's so much that we haven't really sat down together with and said, you know, I think that's a load of crap. Let's unpack that together. You know, I think it might be anti-Semitic to talk about how 9 million women were burnt in Europe because it's not true. and 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, you know, and if we're like, let's be more rigorous. Let's be more scientific. Let's be more emotionally intelligent. Let's be more kind and fierce. And I liked what Luke was saying before when they said calling in. When we develop these relationships of love and trust, those are interesting terms, with each other, we are more willing to call someone in. Like, if I know you, I can Facebook message you and go, hey friend, so I just noticed you shared this link. I don't know if you know, I'm curious, rather than saying blah, 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 boo, boo, boo. It's like, I don't know if you know where that comes from. Like, I'm just want to check why, like, give them a chance first. Like, why did you post that? What do you mean when you say this? Could you clarify that to me? So those are 2 things I've learned from my friend Raven Stanfield, who's a fairy and reclaiming priestess. I'm curious about, and could you please clarify? So that's how I go to my friends and acquaintances in pagandom and witchdom when they share or say things that maybe they don't know are racist, are transphobic, are misogynistic. you know, or anti-immigrant or anti-refugee, like all the fucking things that exist in for some reason amongst us. And, you know, so that's what I do. I'm like, I'm curious about why you said this. Could you please clarify this? Because I feel like hurt, or I feel sorrow, or I feel, and when we can do that, when we can say that I feel hurt or sorrowful, often people are like, oh shit, often, not all the time, but sometimes like, oh fuck, because I've done that. I've been like, oh fuck, I'm so sorry, that was not my intention, but I see that that was my impact. How can I figure this out, you know? Whew, what a world.
I would like to, when I was hearing you talk, I was thinking, yeah, there seems to be this cult of conformity that even the pagan community has fallen prey to. And I think with certain people is that it's not so much that they intend to be hurtful, it's that they've been so influenced by conformity that they may not know they are offensive. And that's, I think, where I feel like I don't have enough information, because my experience has been predominantly as a cis woman. And so it's like, how do we learn to be better? How can we move forward? Because I know that a lot of times is that when you're given criticism, which is good, is that it comes in such a harsh manner that we shut down and we don't really process and learn to be better allies.
Mm-hmm. Something I want to throw in there, kind of like piggybacking from you, Amy, is when we hear the word privilege, most of us, you know, like, oh, we cringe, and we have equated the word privilege with like being a bad word. And we have to understand that having privilege does not make you a bad person. Having privilege is not a bad word. It's something you didn't ask for, you were born with it. What you do with that privilege is what makes the difference, right?
Right.
And the other thing, and I love Afia because you keep saying the Empire, and every time you see the Empire, I think about, you know, Star Wars.
Yeah.
And I was thinking like, only Siths deal in absolutes, right? There is no absolute experience on any given group. As a indigenous person of color, my experience is not the same as another person who is also a person of color, whether they're Caribbean or African American or African or indigenous Australian, right? So to kind of like end this stuff with a joke, I always tell people the only two labels that are useful are salt and sugar.
Yeah.
Any other label is, if it is imposed by society, is garbage. And we have to understand the difference between self-identifying as or being labeled as, you know, because I identify as bruja, and I identify as queer, and I identify as badass. But if somebody else tells me, oh, Laura, you are this, and that, I'm like, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
Not because this is your judgment imposed on me. Yeah.
Because what you're talking about is the expression of your agency and sovereignty versus the oppressive systems that would like to segregate us and divide us.
Yes.
And I also like, I know, Chris, I know.
It's okay. It's okay. We haven't seen you in forever, so you go ahead.
I mean, I also think that part of it is like, I think that in both Ruby's response and in yours, Laura, I'm hearing this feeling of like protection, of like, oh, that really hurts. Like, people called me privileged, that really hurts. Like, I need to sort of withdraw and like protect myself. Or like, I was just called out, this is really uncomfortable. I really don't want to interact with that. And I think that part of that, and I think that, Theo, I really loved your point about like a witch's job is tearing apart the hegemony. Because like we're taught from pretty much the word go to identify with the hegemony, right? We're taught to be
What is
like
hegemony?
the
Sounds like a made-up word, but I know it's not.
let's call it. I mean, let's call it the cis white heterosexual patriarchy, right?
Okay. All right. Okay.
We're taught that that's the best you can be. You want to be the best that you can be. You want to be that. You want as much of that in you as possible, right? And we're taught when we're, especially in America, when we're thinking about like ourselves as Americans, right? That's very much participating in this cultural myth of empire. So the moment we start being like, let's take this myth apart a little bit, it feels like a personal attack. It feels like, let's try to tear you down. Spoilers, it sucks. It's going to be painful, but like, that's what witchcraft is, right? Like, in order to separate from this, I see a lot of people going through a really painful process of self-reflection and like just trying to make distinct what is actually them and what is this worldview that has been taught to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that you are actively incentivized to have, right? Like you identify with this, you play the game well, you're going to make more money. You're going to like do all these things if you have the privilege to be able to do so.
Right.
And in order to like actually, I think, live into our diversity and into our unique experiences, we have to start recognizing that that's a problem, and that there is a uniqueness to each of us that is stifled by this narrative. And I guess I'm just saying that's really hard for a lot of good reasons, but absolutely necessary to do, I would say, the work. There's probably a more useful way of saying that, but what we're here to do.
Right. Oh, I have so many thoughts and things. So I want to say, both Luke and Theo, you guys have really very eloquently said some amazing things, and you know, it gives us so much to think about and stuff like that. One of the things I want to kind of talk about is this whole idea, and we touched on it before, about how pagan leaders, and how I define a pagan leader, to be honest, if and you don't have to be necessarily ordained and accredited, but if you are leading some sort of a community, that makes you, in my own eyes, that makes you a leader. I would also go on to say, if you're in the public eye as an author, a speaker, a blogger, a YouTube show, whatever, because if you have influence on people in any way, and sometimes it doesn't mean you have experience, it means you say, I have information for you, I know something, and people believe it. You know, one of the things that, well, before, hey, I stopped myself from getting off track. I'm very proud of myself. But bringing it back to like pagan leaders who will not, or who whatever person who refuses to basically evolve, you know, because, and unfortunately, I hate to lump people in a category, but in my experience, there's a lot of older pagans who were taught in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and even who won't let stuff go. And it's almost like you touched on it, Theo, when you have this narrative of history, of what witchcraft history is, or what pagan history is, they're chained to it, you know. I'm going to say, you know, because part of what I enjoy about traditional witchcraft is it does try to piece together some parts of history, but I think there's a difference between saying, hey, here's a good part of art and history that I like, for example, the gods and, Persephone, things like that. But we need to take out the things that are not allowing us to evolve as human beings. Like, for example, the whole men, women, blah, 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 which I wasn't ever taught that, to be honest. I read about it in books. I was never taught that because I've always been a part of gay groups and things like that. So it would never really occur to us to have the whole male female polarity. I mean, and the Fellowship of the Phoenix is open to all LGBTQ, but like, I don't mean that. I mean that whole straight man, straight woman, stuff like that. I feel like, and I've had conversations with people, and I try not to. I I feel like sometimes, there are certain people who are going to hear you, and there are certain people who won't hear you. And I've gotten to the point where, and this is privilege, I will absolutely say this is my privilege, that some of those people, I'm like, I'm not going to change you, so why bother? I want to focus on a community who does want to evolve and want to grow and want to learn and want to teach each other. I don't want to say call each other out, but teach each other, educate each other. And it's sad because a lot of these leaders, I guess, they have a following. Because I'm going to tell you, Rowling isn't going out of business anytime soon. She's not. She has a huge privileged straight following, and that makes me sad because I necessarily don't believe that every time someone makes a mistake or speaks at a turn that their career should be over. But I do think if you refuse to acknowledge the things you've said or the things that you've done time and time again, that people can actually say, instead of saying, hey, you're bad or you're not evolving, that we quit paying for them, we quit buying their books and things like that. So I think we need to be in a place where pagan leadership is able to hear feedback, and some of them aren't hearing it,
And I mean, I think that it's worth differentiating here, right? Because like a lot of the conversation we've been having so far is like people who are dealing with the difficult work of like self-reflection and like need to be called in, right? Need to be like, this thing that you said is not great. Let's like talk about it, right? I think that there's a really meaningful and distinct subsection of pagan leadership that have kind of crossed a boundary. Rowling's a good example. I don't think that we can argue J.K. Rowling into like being trans affirming. I think that that's probably a little far. But like if I went down a list of pagan leadership that have been proven to have done really awful things to their followers or their communities, like we've got 5 minutes left in this hour. Like I can't do it. And I think that I think that there's also something to be said for like being really clear in community when someone is being harmful to members of your community, and needs to be that needs to be very clear. Like that, if you are actually trying to have an inclusive space, you need to have things that make sure that people who have internalized some of this awful stuff, right, are not in a position to harm others. And that's a much more difficult conversation than I think we have time for now. But like, I don't think we can just be like, oh, we can just talk to them and they'll come around all the time.
No. I want to briefly try to speak to this thing that I see happen every time. Like I will counter someone or someone will counter one of these leaders, so-called leaders. and a lot of them do have impact and influence. So I guess they are leaders that I don't like. But there's this thing that will happen, and often you're right, Chris. It's often from an older demographic, but not always. Like many people who are like decades older than me are really quick to like adapt their views and have taught me about that. But there's this thing that happens when, you know, especially with the trans debate, and I hate that, or conversation, is that, oh, but you're just being reactive and emotional and you're not listening to science, or you're not listening to like the way things are, or you're not, you know, and this idea of like, here are the facts, and look, there are trans women are their own category. They're not women, they're trans women. And I'm like, what the fuck? So this happened to me recently. Like very recently, that article by Gus Dezeriga came out, and I went to Hammertown on it. Like I went, I don't care anymore. I have no shits like to give, and I am just gonna go for it. And I did in several forums and on my own page. And I just, because I'm just like, no, I can't. I do have influence, and I have a lot of people that are in my life that sometimes look to me to be that person. And so I'm going to just be that person right now. Like, and so I kind of went through and I criticized everything. And that person, apparently a leader, I've never met him, I know some people who know him, came and started talking about how, well, where are the facts? And I just didn't feel like I could respond, because I knew that anything I would say would be retorted, because apparently there's no room for emotion, which is such a white thing. Like, you know, when people are like, let's have a civil debate, let's have a calm conversation. Like, clearly you've never sat at a table with a bunch of brown and black people, but whatever. Like, because we're allowed to throw things, and we're allowed to be angry, and we're allowed to have color, and we're allowed to communicate in all kinds of different ways. But apparently you're just meant to be polite and civil and sit there. And I'm like, there are other ways of communicating. And anger is sacred, and if I'm feeling anger and rage at this, I'm allowed to express that. And that is also a way of drawing a line and being like, no, like, think about what you're doing, you know.
I also think that anybody who says, oh, well, we have to have a civil debate where no emotion enters into it has just dissociated from their emotions far enough that they think that they're being like objective.
Exactly.
I've never run into one of those people who's been like, oh, well, you're just up in your emotions, who wasn't doing the exact same thing.
I don't think I've ever had a conversation to where I didn't. I mean, you see how I am just all the time. Like, this is just how I am every single day, my speaking voice. I can't imagine being like calm, especially. So one of the things that I was learning was about tone policing, and you know there is a big difference between saying you can't have a feeling, or you can't express your feeling, versus yelling just to yell for the sake of yelling. So for example, like, I guess and that's a hard one too, because like this, if you're repressing me, or you're repressing my community, I'm gonna yell at you. I'm going to yell at you. But you know, I guess if it isn't important to the other speaker or the other person in the conversation, then that's when they have, I guess, the privilege of saying, oh, lower your tone. Well, that's because you're not angry about it. You know, you're not angry. It doesn't affect you. It affects us, or affects my friends, or affects my community, or whatever.
Well, think about, like Fia was saying earlier with the femme experience, where we are deemed to be too emotional all the time.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, Laura, is that the realm of emotion is relegated to the feminine, which Theo pointed out is seen as, if a man embraces femininity, then that's bad. So because the feminine has been relegated to this awful state, the emotional realm is usually assigned to the feminine side.
Theo, we're at the end of our hour. Do you have some final thoughts?
I think something that happens online is this idea that we are like, well, this concept that we're distanced and that we are able to therefore have these like really objective conversations without, you know, free from passion. But if we're going to like change, like plant these situations that happen on Facebook or in other social media into like the 3D world. And imagine that like a pagan leader just like kind of strides up to you in your community that is sitting around a fire having a good time and just starts telling you, not talking to the trans people in that circle around the fire, but you, oh, by the way, trans people aren't real, and trans people this and trans people that, or they come and like spit on you or they punch you, because this is some of the equivalencies of what happens on social media. It's like, imagine not reacting. Like in my mind, if someone is being verbally or emotionally or physically violent, like violating their dignity and their worth in front of you, it is my job to affirm and defend them. Like, it is my job. If that's happening physically, then I need to be like, no, you have to stop that now. Or I have to take them away from the fire and my people and be like, let's have this conversation over here, if the conversation is, you know, able to be had at all. Or otherwise, then just like, fuck off, go away.
Right.
We don't want you here. And but if that same stuff happens on Facebook, and Facebook is like notoriously not a great way of talking most of the time. Like if someone says, hey, actually, no, we don't tolerate those views in this Facebook group where we have these delineated rules that you should have read as you came in. Those people get really intense all of a sudden, right? And it's like, no, this is my house. You came into my house, and then you're just like lighting fires and pushing people over. And I don't like you, and you need to go. Like, like that's the thing that we're allowed to do. And I feel like where it's more crunchy for me is in the places where I'm with a friend or a mutual acquaintance or something like that, and we're talking about this like leadership thing, or we are actually like participating in that process of leadership, and they're being really racist, or they're being really misogynistic or transphobic, or I don't know, something else. And that's horrible. And that's when I almost freeze up, you know, because I'm like, oh shit, I'm caught off guard, because we had all of these like moments of parallel, and we were meeting and having emotionally vulnerable dialogue. And now all of a sudden I find out that you're a raging transphobe. Great. Like that's not going to help me want to spend time with you, you know. And sometimes what I do is I just kind of go off and do my own thing, and other times I confront it and call them in or call them out, depending on what is required. But I think for me, like, we lead by example, right? That's a thing that often people say, but I do think it's important to be like, for people who have influence and impact in their communities, to just constantly affirm, right? Like, I affirm this, and I like trans people are welcome at my rituals, and we will do our best to uphold the dignity of all people. These are the views we do not tolerate at our rituals, at our circles, at our classes. So you can leave them at the door or not come at all. Like, I think we're allowed to say all of these things, and the more we do that, it's like the more people do that around race as well, the more there's a sense of safety, or like safer spaces, like rather than safe spaces, like an aspiration towards safer space. And that is why I have spent time on big forums with thousands of people that I actually don't really post in. When I see transphobic and racist articles being shared, which recently I have, this is a very specific story, I decided to counter those things in this huge forum, because lots of new people are in that forum, you know, new people who are new to the craft or paganism or the occult, who are trans and people of color, or younger women who are often preyed upon by older men in pagandom. That happens all the time. And so it's like, how do those of us who have some clout and have some impact go, actually no, so that these other people who are often very quiet on those forums, because they're just checking it out, they're like, is this a place for me? So they can see, there is someone countering this. There is a space for me, but it's maybe not with that person, right? That maybe I can have a side conversation with that person, because otherwise we actually lose. How many times have I had a conversation with like a young person of color or an older trans person or vice versa, who is like, says to me like, look, I would have come to this 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but my first experience was horrible. So I've kept away from this community for this long. And it's always so heartbreaking, because it's like, I know that happens. It happened to me. Like, I came into the craft community 20 years ago, and I was an adolescent, and all kinds of awful things happened. But because I wanted the craft so much, I just kept going. Like, through the racist comments, through the weird lechery, through the strange rapaciousness, through how I saw men treat women. Like, I was like, just keep going. You'll find your people. You'll find your people. And I had to wade through a lot of shit. And then I found my people. But it's some people that's how I chose to do it. Other people would have a different response. Some people just are like, no, and that's a legitimate response. So I would say, like, it's a job of pagan and witchcraft leaders to be really vocal and expressive and affirming of diversity and transparent. Like, I do not know about this. I do not know about this, but I want to know about this. And I'm going to take responsibility and seek out resources. And I'm going to go and talk to my friends if they'll have me. And I'm going to, try my best and keep trying my best. And when I fall down, I'll get up again. Like, that's what I've got.
Yeah. Well, that was great. Theo, I have to say, you were so insightful about this, and again, I want to say thank you. I appreciate you coming up to the show. We will stop recording in just a second and open up the forum to questions or hello or whatever. And I want to thank everyone, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And we're on Spotify and iTunes and all of those things. And we shall see you guys in 2 weeks. Thank you. You guys have a great night.